Okay, so good evening. For those of you who don't know, I'm Chris Board. I'm the Academic Secretary of the War Studies Society. I've been a little under the weather lately, so if my voice isn't quite as good as it normally is, I can only apologise. Tonight's event, as I'm sure you all know, is going to be about the current Syrian conflict and specifically what role the international community should play. It will not be under Chatham House rules, in case any of you were wondering. So tonight we have, on the left here, Dr. Christopher Phillips from Queen Mary University. He is a regular contributor to The Guardian, as well as Chatham House at Al Jazeera. He's written extensively about the Middle East, as well as the pretty cataclysmic events that have shaped it over the last decade. Recently, though, he's been focusing more on Syria, particularly how different groups in the country have dealt with one another. And some of you may know on the right, Dr. Leenders from King's College. He has had several works published by Stanford and Cornell University presses. He's written extensively on the role of corruption and authoritarianism in the Middle East, and particularly about how they helped bring about the Arab Spring and the subsequent fallout that we currently see. So, Professor Phillips, would you like to start?
Thanks very much, Chris. I thought I'd just give a brief 10-minute kind of introduction to the Syria conflict and kind of where it's at the moment. And I think Aaron's going to talk a bit in more depth over the regime itself. Is that the idea, I think, and then happily kind of things up for some questions. I'm sure you guys have a lot of interesting points to make and have a broader discussion. Okay, so I suppose where are we at now with the Syria conflict would be sort of where I start, and is there any light or hope at the end of the tunnel, and so on. I think it's important when we look at this conflict to start off by saying it's no longer a question of who's going to win. No one's going to win this conflict. This is a complete mess. When people sort of say, are the regime going to win, is the opposition going to win, whoever wins is going to be ruling, if anyone does win, they'll be ruling over a completely shattered country. Whose economy is effectively collapsed, whose population will take arguably, certainly years, maybe decades to sort of reconcile with one another if they ever will. A few tragic statistics: we've got 2 million registered refugees, 4.5 million internally displaced people. There's probably another 2 million refugees that are unregistered. We're basically looking at least a third of the population, the pre-war population of 22 million. Have been displaced, and the UN currently estimate that by the end of this year, half of that pre-war population will be in need of urgent food aid. This is not a situation, a country over which a victor is going to emerge and claim the spoils. The country is already spoiled as such. That said, I kind of want to sort of start off by sort of skewing a few sort of general myths about this conflict that have emerged because of how it has progressed. Firstly, this did not begin as a sectarian conflict. You will hear people talking about the intractable sectarian conflict in Syria. That is not how this began. This began as a domestic political conflict. Those who opposed the regime of Bashar al-Assad and those who wanted it to stay in power, not least the regime itself. It has subsequently developed to a point into a sectarian style conflict, although I would emphasise that it is still not what I call an explicitly sectarian conflict. It is an implicitly sectarian conflict. It is a political divide whereby someone's sect seems to be determining which side of the political divide they are on. That doesn't necessarily mean that they are fighting exclusively for that ethnicity. And as a consequence of that, you've not seen the kind of wide-scale sectarian massacres that signified, for example, the Bosnian Civil War and so on. You've not seen that many people be killed specifically because of their sectarian identity. I'm not saying that there is no sectarianism there, it is obviously there, but thankfully at the moment it seems to be at the extreme fringes. The danger is that this could become at some point an explicitly sectarian civil war, whereby people do define themselves entirely along their sectarian identity. And if and when that happens, I think any kind of reconstitution of Syria will be very, very difficult indeed. So we're not at that point yet, and it's important to note that we're not there. The other thing to note is that this did not begin as a proxy war. Again, repeatedly we hear people say this is a proxy war between the United States and Russia, between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Various conspiracy theories about each side began this in order to displace the other. That's not the case. Again, this was domestically originating, this conflict. Subsequently, different sides have seen advantage in backing one side or the other. However, that does not mean that they initiated things. Unfortunately, this leaves us in a situation whereby, whilst it didn't begin as an international conflict, now it is hard to see a situation whereby it could possibly end without some kind of international agreement. So, it's not a proxy war, and there's a big question about whether or not actually the international backers of each side can exercise enough influence over their different sides to bring about an end. But it's pretty certain to say that until those international players reach some kind of agreement, it's hard to see how the conflict will stop. So an international kind of agreement is very important. So, in terms of where the conflict is at now, with those sort of caveats out of the way, I'd say that on the one hand, we have, sort of, as a question with this conflict, I always say it's sort of like, well, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, or 1 step forward, 2 steps back, depending on whether you're an optimist or a pessimist. We've seen actually quite a significant step forward in the last 2 months or so as a consequence of the chemical weapons issue, as I'm sure you're all aware of, at the United Nations and the alleged attack in Ghouta in Damascus. The step forward in that sense is that for the first time in 2.5 years, you have seen some kind of agreement amongst these international backers. Now, it's not how the United States wanted it. They were basically forced by the Russians into a climb down, into accepting their timetable for chemical disarmament. But for the first time, you did see some movement at the United Nations Security Council, which had basically been in deadlock stalemate for 2.5 years of this conflict. So for the first time, we've seen some kind of agreement. We've seen that international agreement is possible on something in Syria. That's positive. The other thing that's positive is that not only have sort of, I think the Americans have realised their own limitations on the Syria conflict. They've recognised that they're not actually really willing, or indeed able, because of domestic population opposition, to launch a concerted military strike on Syria. They might be able to launch a sort of like a drone attack or something like that, but they certainly can't do any kind of Libyan-style intervention. They've certainly been chased on that. And I think also what we've seen from the Russians is a degree of movement, a willingness to accept that actually when sort of backs are against the wall, they are willing to sort of try to push the Assad regime in a certain direction to achieve their international goals. So I think that is a movement forward. The other movement forward, which hasn't been talked about in as much depth, is a realisation from the regional backers of the different sides, which would be Turkey, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia on the rebel side, and Iran, and through Iran, Iraq and Hezbollah on the regime side. There's been a realisation again that this can't necessarily go on, and they're not actually achieving any of their goals, particularly on behalf of those that are backing the rebels. And different circumstances that are taking place inside these countries, particularly Qatar has recently changed leadership. Turkey is facing a lot of internal opposition, partly because of its position on Syria and the perceived sectarianism that the government of Prime Minister Erdogan is using in order to back the rebels. So we're in a position now where the regional sides are beginning to realise they can't achieve the goals that they wanted through military means. And I think that's quite an important moment. They're not quite at that point yet, but these sides that seem to reject any kind of negotiation initially are each beginning to entertain the possibility of it. I think that came to fruition, firstly with regard to the chemical weapons agreement at the UN, and also, it's very, very early to tell, but also this slight détente between the United States and Iran that we've seen in recent weeks illustrate firstly that the Western sanctions on Iran are hurting the Iranian regime and they need to do something about it, and compromising a little bit on Syria is one possible way they might do it. So that's our step forward, is that for the first time the international community appear to be coming closer together. I'm not saying they are together, but they're certainly closer together than they have been for a long time. The step back is unfortunately at the same time, the actors inside Syria seem further and further away from any kind of reconciliation, any kind of agreement to a truce. Starting with the rebels who for the last 2.5 years, the international community have tried very hard to unify and bring together in order to topple the regime. They look further and further away from either uniting or accepting external orders as such, or externally imposed settlement. We've recently seen the most powerful Islamist groups, a group of 11 Islamist fighting groups, publicly reject the Western-backed exiled opposition groups, the Syrian National Coalition for the Opposition, and their military alternative, the military expression, the Free Syria Army Supreme Military Command. So you've seen a large group of Islamist groups reject the Western vision for the opposition. And indeed they're moving to a more radical Islamist agenda. So the chances that even if, the step back comes in, the chances that even if the external backers of the rebels can agree on some kind of negotiated solution in Syria, it's very questionable whether or not the majority of the fighting groups on the ground will actually accept that and play ball. With regard to the regime, there's a massive question about how much the external supporters of the regime, particularly Iran and Russia, can actually tell the regime what to do. Some people have jumped on the chemical weapons deal and said, great, this shows that the Russians have genuine leverage over the Assad regime. It shows that they can, say, we want you to demilitarize your chemical weapons and that will work. Well, that was the case because actually the regime saw that its survival was threatened and it was able to adapt in order to survive and prevent an American military strike. That doesn't necessarily mean that the Russians say, jump, the regime will say, how high? And indeed, if any negotiation is going to take place, it's expected by most people that it will require Bashar al-Assad to stand down as a precondition. And indeed, getting any of the rebels to agree to this is highly questionable unless Bashar agrees to stand down. So, and indeed, recently Bashar has said quite publicly in various media interviews, with Western media in particular, he said he's not willing to negotiate either with anyone involved in Al-Qaeda, as he says, which is basically all the Islamist groups, or indeed anyone who agreed with the notion of an American strike, which is all of the Western-backed American groups as well. So he's basically said, I'll negotiate, but not with anyone who's actually in the opposition. So we're in a position now, like I say, where even though the international players in this conflict seem closer than they've been before, I would say that the internal players, the regime and the rebels, are further apart than they've been before, and it's highly questionable whether or not the external players can actually get them to come to some kind of agreement. And so the question is, therefore, with that in mind, where are we going to go, and does the sort of chemical weapons issue offer some kind of hope, I say? And I'm afraid to say my conclusion is really, I don't think it does offer any kind of hope. I think in many ways, despite this success for the non-proliferation of chemical weapons, it really is a distraction from the real issue, which is the resolution of the Syrian civil war. And I think what's going to happen is we're going to see the continuation of the trend that we've seen so far, which is the Assad regime sticking its heels in, cooperating with its external backers when it comes to issues of survival, but not actually offering any kind of compromise that might lead to its end, while simultaneously shoring itself up in the areas of Syria that it controls. Meanwhile, I think you're going to see the further fragmentation of the opposition, a large fighting body of which are going to continue to radicalise, which indeed will continue to serve the regime's arguments that it is the only alternative to radical Islamists controlling Syria. And so, unless something dramatic changes on the ground, and I can't really see that happening, I think we're going to be in a position where even if the international community can agree some kind of deal on Syria, they will really, really struggle to get it implemented on the ground. Thanks.
the applicant.
Well, thank you very much. It's actually hard to add. I think I largely agree with your assessment. Thank you very much for that. What I wanted to talk about is basically based on a paper I wrote recently, and actually it's a kind of logical sequel to work I've done before, and that concerned the widespread assumption, the notion that authoritarian governance is often being portrayed as something anachronistic, not of this time, usually portrayed as something that is out of touch, doesn't have the level of sophistication to respond to change, political change and challenges, both domestically and regionally or even internationally. So actually there was a long time, and there is actually, yeah, that authoritarianism was actually being laughed about a little bit and not taken very seriously. And I think that's also reflected in common assessments of the Syrian regime, particularly at the start of this crisis in March 2011, but still rather prevalent in a lot of assumptions that are being made, particularly by Western media and Western policymakers, but also actually by Arab media and policymakers. And that's an assumption that this regime basically was not sophisticated enough to respond intelligently to uprising. It was not sophisticated enough to kind of channel the kind of popular energies in the streets in the beginning of mobilization into less harmful avenues. And basically, because of that, the conclusion was often drawn. Its numbers were counted. I think by now it's high time to reassess that image of this regime as stupid, basically, and out of touch. And I think that's not only for the sake of academic adequate analysis, but also because I think that whatever outsiders, Arab outsiders and Western outsiders are going to do or not do with regards to this escalating and protracted crisis, I think it's really necessary to base that on an adequate reading, at least of what the regime is doing and is capable of. Let me go through a few of those instances and themes whereby I think the regime particularly showed that it was highly responsive, even calculative, rational even to an extent, was constantly learning by doing and being very adaptive, if by trial and error, and still under siege, without indeed achieving complete victory, but at least surviving, even as a former shadow of its, or as a shadow of its former self. And I think even they may not be winning the conflict as such, but by just hanging on, by just preventing that kind of doomsday scenario from a regime perspective of massive retribution after it would come to fall. Even if they manage to protract that and delay that, I think the regime would consider the current situation as actually being in its favor. Let's go back to the start of the uprising, or actually even a month before that. Bashar al-Assad, the Syrian president, gave an interview to the Wall Street Journal and made a lot of predictions that obviously turned out all to be wrong. He predicted that Syrian society was not into this maelstrom of mobilization and regime contestation like the Tunisians and the Egyptians, because he said we are a different country, we actually are in touch with our population, and they also have an appreciation of our kind of more radical, more critical foreign policies with regards to Israel and the United States and so on. So he kind of declared that Syria was to be immune to mass mobilization. Now obviously he was wrong, as we've all seen, we have witnessed the reports at the time of massive mobilization at an unprecedented scale and totally mesmerizing scale. Now I would argue that, as was often put forward as an interpretation, that didn't really signify that the regime was out of touch or prove that it indeed was being not sophisticated enough to save its own skin. In fact, I think if you look at theories on mass mobilization, popular mobilization, or revolution, I think if you take the consensus within these theories, academic theories, there's very little in there that could have predicted what happened and evolved in Syria either. So conventional theories on revolutions would kind of highlight, for example, that there must be changes in the opportunity structure. And often these opportunities, they arise out of sudden cracks within the regime, loss at the battlefield in interstate wars, things like that. So dramatic kind of moments that kind of shift perceptions and shift the balance towards people who want to mobilize and challenge the regime. And nothing of that happened in the Syrian context in early 2011. There were no cracks, there was no defeat in international war or anything like that. So I think even if the regime could be accused of having misread the situation in its own country, I think you could likewise accuse academicians and theorists on mobilization and theories for missing out on what would happen in Syria. Now, a second kind of argument that has been put forward in this context of portraying this regime as being unsophisticated, stupid even, and doing embarking on all sorts of ill-advised policies and strategies, concerns its immediate use of heavy-handed force and repression, recalling the events in Daraa particularly, where in response to fairly localized protests, the regime just responded with massive force and pretty quickly also sending in tanks and totally disproportionate to the challenge at hand, one could argue. But I think the regime, moral considerations aside, read the situation quite correctly at the time and thought that in the context of what was happening at the same time in Tunisia and in Egypt and elsewhere in the region, thought that any form of mass mobilization would very quickly kind of snowball and diffuse and spread throughout the country. And they thought that the only way to respond to this was by applying massive force. Now that may have turned out to be counterproductive, as repression indeed seemed to have played a role in encouraging people to get into the streets and increasing their numbers and challenge to the regime. But again, if you look at theories that within social movement theory particularly, but also within theories on policing and these kind of things, and riot control, there is no consensus whatsoever about what is called the repression-mobilization nexus, a rather euphemistic term for does massive repression, coercion, does it work in clamping down on mobilization, reducing mobilization, or does it do the opposite? It actually fuels the flames of mobilization. There's no consensus on that, and in fact, in different situations, historically, recently, repression has worked out in very different ways. Coming back to the Syrian regime, I think they read the situation correctly in the sense that they felt that when you have one region or even region mobilizing, and you wouldn't clamp down on it with a strong iron fist, it would quickly spread elsewhere. Then the regime was basically having to struggle with the diffusion of protests and mobilization. Initially, it thought it could kind of contain the protest in Dada, but very quickly they were proven wrong. Still, they used, and they continued to use rather consistently, massive force to crush protest diffusion. Now, it didn't stop protest diffusion, but I think it certainly contributed to the militarization of anti-regime mobilization, markedly so at the end of 2011. Now, there are some indications to believe that the regime in this context may have reasons that this in turn will transform the confrontation between the regime and the protesters into a game wherein the regime, given its superior military capabilities, would stand a much better chance to win or survive. Now, whatever its exact calculation may have been, the regime proved right to have gambled on its comparative advantage in military force. And to date, no significant foreign support materialized in the sense that it could tip the balance in the rebels' favor. In this context, the more militarized the Syrian uprising became, also the more jihadist fighters rose to the prominence, if only because they were fully motivated, better equipped, and experienced to engage the regime militarily. And that, of course, was exactly the kind of opposition that the regime had propagated, imagined to be countering from the start in its justifications for stamping out overwhelmingly peaceful mobilization, at least in the first month. Now, the way in which the protesters and later the insurgents organized is very much based on rather diffuse, loose networks. A kind of central, coherent leadership to date has failed to emerge. They drew largely on diffuse, clan-based, on tribal solidarity networks, and in many ways that proved to be a serious obstacle for security forces and the regime's intelligence agencies in Baghdad, because they really didn't have a clue what or who was driving these protests and later the armed attacks evolving into a militarized uprising. So they failed to fully penetrate such clan-based networks. What they did in response, and what they could allow themselves to do, is that basically they immediately used identity markers, very crude identity markers, to kind of paralyze the level of the intensity of mobilization. And it's something that they have consistently done ever since they responded to what happened in Dara. In Dara, there are 5 or 6 kind of prominent clans, rather. They're often called tribes, but you could actually better call them kind of extended family clans. And particularly in one part of Dara, the kind of predominant clan is that of the Abu Zayd clan. Now, the clan as such, organized in loose networks, gives a lot of kind of social capital and coherence and solidarity and other kind of resources that enabled people to go into the streets. And the regime realized that very well. And even though they were still trying to go after the leadership, which they, rather elusive leadership, which they failed to pin down, they basically started arresting and targeting everybody who was part of the Abu Zayd clan. Now they did that subsequently as well throughout the country when the conflict became more complex. But still, mobilization and the insurgency was very much based on these loose networks, very fragmented and decentralized and so on, giving a lot of advantage to the mobilizers and challengers. Because there was no leadership to be arrested, which could have undermined or paralyzed mobilization. Again, the regime responded by focusing on identity markers, very crude identity markers, and basically started rounding up people with Sunni Arab names, or targeting, even flattening entire areas and neighborhoods that were known to be populated by Sunni Arabs. But that, of course, had enormous consequences for how the role of identity started to become essential in this conflict. And I agree with you that the conflict cannot be reduced to sectarian animosities or hostilities. And and also it didn't start as a sectarian conflict. One kind of puzzling issue has been how an overwhelmingly peaceful mobilization and protest, how it kind of started to use violence against regime targets. And it's a question that's not very much looked at. It's often assumed you have different arguments. Of course, you have the regime argument saying, well, this was a terrorist, jihadist, Salafi conspiracy from the start, funded by Saudi Arabia and Qatar and so on. And that's why it was only logical that it was going to be a terrorist violent uprising. Now, obviously, there's very little truth in that argument, particularly if you look at the first months. There are other arguments as well, mostly put forward by the opposition and accepted by a lot of Western and Arab media, which suggest that the uprising started to militarize because of the defections, which inevitably occurred in response to the regime ordering troops to use disproportionate violence against peaceful civilian protesters. The people defected, they took their arms with them, they basically had no choice being pursued by the regime to join the opposition. And as a consequence of that, arms and peaceful protests started to combine. That's an argument. If you look at exactly how the defections evolved, it actually started to reach significant numbers at a much later stage. I would argue, there are other arguments about the militarization, early militarization of the uprising can be mentioned as well. But I would argue that tribal identity and sectarian identities being highlighted and underscored by regime tactics from the start, by its very crude kind of policies and repression, played a significant role in motivating, framing, justifying, and facilitating the use of violence. Particularly up till the end of 2011, when violence became more organized, institutionalized, and basically took the shape of an organized insurgency. Now, by pulling the sectarian card, or the identity card rather, also allowing for its manipulation of the Kurdish issue, the regime, of course, must have realized that there was a risk of blowback. Most of the rank and file and the foot soldiers in Syria's and armed forces are Sunni Arabs, and it's indeed among these Sunni Arabs that the most defections occurred. So by playing the identity card, or the sectarian card, they had to reckon with a blowback effect, that this would also encourage defections among its own forces. Now what it did, up to a year ago, was very cleverly anticipating on this, by basically relying on its key Praetorian units, elite troops basically, such as the Republican Guards, the 4th Armored Division, Special Forces regiments, basically using them in spearheading repression, rotating them throughout the country as much as possible, and indeed exhausting these forces to great extent. In order to allow for the use of regular troops and avoid more defections, they basically paired these elite troops with ordinary regular troops, and which had a dampening effect on defection, and actually, with the course of time, also led to the situation that regular troops also became increasingly complicit in the regime's atrocities, whereby the appetite for defection among regular forces waned, just as a shared sense of threat perceived by them increased with the rising prominence of jihadist enemies. Now, very briefly, because I'm talking for too long, I suppose, there are other ways that the regime has shown a high degree of responsiveness and adaptability and learning capability. There's a consensus among academic analysts, or analysts more generally, on the root causes of the Syrian uprising. Often what is being argued is that the root causes should be found at least somewhere in the regime having abandoned its kind of social contract with the population at large, whereby essentially a patrimonial arrangement swapping material favors beyond the regime's immediate circles for political quietness and obedience. That they abandoned this kind of social contract with the kind of economic reforms, and to paraphrase one observer, that led to a lot of poverty and socio-economic grievances, and in that situation something had to give, and basically was translated into mobilization. It's a classic argument also more generally in trying to explain mass mobilization and revolution. Now this may or may not turn out to be a persuasive or sufficient explanation for the uprising, and the way I phrase it already suggests that I don't think it is. But the regime thought likewise and actually shared in this academic consensus, judging from the ways in which it's responded, throwing a lot of subsidies as much as it could at key constituencies during the crisis, and lifting cuts on subsidies, and also ensuring at a later stage, at the current stage essentially, that at least within the enclaves it controls, government institutions continue to function and civil servants got paid, and impressively so. Private entrepreneurs were encouraged, and some say forced, to spend considerable sums on humanitarian aid to the displaced and suffering civilians in regime-controlled areas. International aid providers, such as those operating under the umbrella of the UNHCR, were forced to work with the regime if they hoped to stay in the country. Now, to increasingly war-weary citizens residing in the regime's territories, the message was clear. If you value some normalcy, the regime is your best bet for survival. The regime also, I think, has been highly effective in its propaganda kind of policies. In all sorts of ways, it has basically managed to persuade the entire world that this is a clash between the regime and a jihadist, Salafist uprising. Now, no one suddenly began to like the regime for that, but a more nuanced assessment of the prominence of extremist jihadist groups and their actual leverage in the conflict increasingly got lost. Basically saying that even though the jihadist Salafists play a prominent role in the uprising and the insurgency, and they do have control over large parts of the territory, I would argue that in most of the so-called liberated territories, non-radical jihadist Salafists are in charge. And indeed, it's the forces still under the Free Syrian Army that are doing most of the anti-regime fighting as we speak. Okay, I'm going to skip a lot, and I come to a conclusion for the sake of provocation, I suppose. I want to recall an article that probably you may have come across in February 2011. Women's magazine Vogue published its notorious and flattering portrait of Syria's First Lady Asma and her husband Bashar. Now certainly it was ill-timed, deceptive and repulsive even, but its depiction of the couple, this couple as wealthy and sophisticated, Asma was even granted a killer IQ, I quote, now appears less far off the mark than the broken record still played by Western and Arab policy makers and media about the crumbling regime as injudicious, anachronistic and bound to wither due to its own foolhardiness. I think at the end of the day, there may be a lot of discussion and good reasons for all in favor or against certain forms of intervention by the outside world, and we can discuss that in the Q&A. But I think that the assessment of the regime should not stand in the way of a clear-eyed analysis of the regime's responsiveness, adaptability and resilience that any form of outside intervention will have to reckon with. Whether this will be consisting of sanctions, more sanctions, diplomacy, armed support or military strikes. Thank you.
And on that note, I think we'll move to questions. So we'll go two at a time and they can respond. So let's question. So we have one there and one at the front here.
Right. I'm Yuji, I'm a student of war studies at the Strand. We often blame the Assad government for the barbaric methods. However, concerning prisoners of war, what would your assessment be on the treatment of prisoners of war on both sides?
I'm going to ask you to be brave. How do you think the Syrian civil war will be concluded? And what effect do you think that will have on the regional international backers such as Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Iran, or if there would be any ramifications, and why?
We are just collecting a couple of questions.
Yeah, yes.
Others respond.
Feel free to respond to those.
Okay. Do you want to pick one?
I thought the second one and the first one would be.
Okay. On prisoners of war. I haven't seen much coming out of Syria which suggests that either side are taking massive numbers of prisoners of war, and they would certainly not call them as such. The regime is widely believed to have rounded up a massive number of people, probably talking about tens of thousands of people arrested. But I don't think they make a distinction between prisoners of war or prisoners of conscience or otherwise. They're basically given equal treatment, depending on in which hands they fall, in which kind of Mukhabarat agency or other government institution. They are all treated badly. I think we can be certain about that. And I wouldn't be surprised that a lot of them just fall into a kind of extrajudicial pit and disappear from that. Judging from what the regime has been doing consistently over the last few decades beyond this crisis. On the rebel side, I haven't heard much about them taking prisoners of war or even use that terminology. And there have been some widely published incidents whereby prisoners of regime forces were basically executed on the spot and tortured and so on. And I would agree that this conflict cannot be reduced to sectarianism or to identity issues. But I think the identity issues and the ways in which people have, both sides have used identity as a framer of their actions. I think if we want to look for answers for the intensity and sheer barbarity of the conflict, I think we will find some answers there.
Attempt to address the how of the regime, how the war end. As I see it, there are four ways this can end, but two of them are more likely than the others at the moment. Option one, again, I don't think anyone can win, the regime wins. What does that require? It requires a large number of people currently occupied areas, so occupied the liberated, the non-regime areas, to accept the regime's rule again. So the thing is that if you look at where the borders have now fallen and where refugees have gone and so on, effectively the people in the regime held areas, which is along the coast, down to Damascus and across to Sweden in the south, are people who, for one reason or another, accept the regime's rule. They either too scared or they actually support it or whatever, but they are not actively rebelling against the regime. That's not the case in the places where the regime is not controlling. And one of the main problems the regime has is manpower. Even if it could militarily reconquer sort of Aleppo, Raqqa, the places that the rebels currently control, it's questionable whether or not those populations would accept them back there, which is one of the reasons why they withdrew in the first place, because it's difficult to actually control those areas. So you need those places to accept the regime's rule. That would only really happen if the opposition fighters were ruling so poorly that people felt like the only alternative actually the regime would fetch and so on, plus the huge amount. The regime would need a huge amount more support than it's currently getting from international backers. To cut a long story short, it seems unlikely that will happen. Option 2 would be for the reverse to happen, for the rebels to win and take over the regime. That would require the reverse situation. That would require the people currently living in the regime territory to accept the rebels, who a lot of them see as jihadists, whether that's correct or not, to accept their rule, which also seems unlikely. Moreover, again, they would need an even greater injection of foreign firepower, probably some kind of major bombing campaign from the outside world, huge amount of military hardware, and they need to actually unify enough in order to take over that situation. That might be helped perhaps if there was an internal struggle within the regime that might weaken the state, but even then I think it's very difficult for the rebels to ever reach a point where they could conquer the whole state. So those two options, regime winning, rebels winning, I don't think are likely, which leaves two other options. One is, and again I think either could happen, it's difficult to sort of predict. One is the de facto recognition of the stalemate situation we have at the moment. At the moment you've got, three main zones. You've got the regime zone, you've got the loose area, which might be called the rebel zone, or might be the area that the regime doesn't control, because actually it's kind of descending into a kind of warlordism, different militia control different areas, and then you've got local councils controlling different parts, sometimes connected to the militia, sometimes not connected to the militia, but it's basically the regime doesn't control it. And then of course you've got the Kurdish region in the northeast as well. Without any international agreement, that could just gradually be recognised. People could, the two sides could come to some kind of unofficial agreement whereby that partition is effectively allowed. I don't think that's possible indefinitely, but you could see that go on for a long time in those sort of areas, controlled to a point that there might be some kind of solution, perhaps leading to a permanent partition. I don't know. Therefore, the most likely, I think, is some kind of negotiated transition, which is option 4. The big question, and I don't think that we can answer now, is what that will look like. Because it requires so many different variables to affect. So, you try to make a negotiated transition now. As I said before, the problem is who's negotiating with it. Will the regime agree to negotiate anything that might actually compromise their power? I don't think so, because, as was suggested, they're actually in not such a bad position in their mind. Will you get any of the rebels to agree to negotiate? And even if you get some to agree, will the rest of the rebels recognise that leadership and recognise that deal? I don't think so. An alternative might be, well, okay, if you're an external backer, like the Russians or even the Iranians, might you try and get someone other than Bashar to negotiate on the regime's behalf? Would you perhaps, try to engineer some kind of coup against Bashar and get them to strike some kind of deal with what's left of the rebels? I think that might be possible. I think the Russians would try that. What I don't know, and I think this is what we really need to understand about the regime, and I don't think we know at the moment, is whether or not anyone would dare inside the regime attempt that kind of thing, because if they got found out by Bashar loyalists, they'd almost certainly sort of be for the chop and so on. So that would be a major question. And even then, if that happened, again, the same problem: have you got anyone in the rebel camp that is willing to negotiate and can have some kind of negotiated transition to work? My fear is that this will end up concluding more out of exhaustion than anything else. This could go on for 5 years, 10 years. Who knows what will happen in that time? But you might get sort of some international agreement to attempt an externally imposed solution, like that was tried in the one that was tried in Bosnia, Dayton Agreement, where basically you say, okay, wherever you stopped fighting, though these are now separate provinces of Syria, which could happen. That's kind of where we are at the moment, and you better like it or lump it, or we're going to bomb you or something like that. That would require a huge shift in the mentality of the external backers, but it could happen if they really felt that the situation had to end. I don't think that would work, but that's one option. An alternative might be something even worse, which would be a broader sort of Balkanization program, again requiring a shift in mentality from the international community to really start caring and start trying to sort of impose some kind of severing up of Syria into ethnically based statelets, and Al-Assad has been mentioned, or Kurdistan in the north. That would also be disastrous. Syrian sectarian identity is nowhere near hardened enough for something like that to work, and of course it would require massive ethnic cleansing in areas that are actually mixed and dominated by a certain group, but certainly not exclusively. Or alternatively, they could impose some kind of Lebanese solution, whereby you again, using your starting point, sectarian identity, and getting people to vote on some kind of sectarian-based quota system, whereby certain groups have certain quotas inside Parliament. I don't think anyone will agree to that. I don't think that would work. And again, you still have this problem, which I keep going back to, which is how on earth can you get the rebels to agree to something like that, and they can't even agree to something among themselves. So I'm going to posit a guess how it's going to end. I think it's not going to end for a very long time, and when it is, I think that the Syria that we look at will be quite dramatically transformed. So it's hard to say exactly what that will look like, but I think some kind of negotiated solution will look at that. But who's in power at which time will be hard to say. Which is a bit of a lame answer, really.
Could I possibly add something to that? With the risk of sounding even more pessimistic than you are. I think there's another additional scenario that may be worthwhile considering in order to prepare ourselves for it to the extent we can. That's a situation whereby indeed no one wins, but the regime starts to lose out more than the rebels. Now that wouldn't mean that the conflict would end. It would basically mean that the kind of regime will transform, or might transform, in what it already has been doing to some extent, away from the kind of facade of being a sovereign state and its institution and what have you. But basically, the regime then kind of degrades into becoming one of the many even important militia factions in the country. And that could simply drag on forever as well. So a protracted conflict, but not one between regime versus the rebels, but among various militia groups. And on what you said about the hypothetical conclusions that outside powers, both in the region and beyond, could be drawing, basically saying, "Oh, this has to end." And I agree that that would be incredibly important. And the only thing I can think of, that kind of consensus that could have an effect on stopping or at least lessening the violence. What I'm worried about in this context, it sounds a bit contradictory perhaps, is that the Syrian conflict has actually witnessed very little, relatively speaking, spill over to the rest of the region, to the degree that neighboring countries would start to get worried about the Syrian conflict. I think actually, despite all the talk about the spillover, the potential of spillover of the Syrian conflict to the region, the opposite has happened. The conflicts in the region have spilled over to Syria and are being contained there. And I'm worried about the situation, is that a lot of the kind of main protagonists in the region are actually quite content with having their little fights, or big fights, within Syria. So
I would also just add to that, just again to add to the wave of pessimism that's come through it. But of course, the difference of what's concerning actually about Syria and sort of the wider fate of the Arab uprising, if you call it the Arab Spring, is that the violence has just become normalised once again. If you look at sort of how the media is portraying things and so on, Syria used to be the front pages, now it's become like a rat wars, which is just, oh, more deaths in Syria, the fight is going on. I remarked the other day that after 50 people were killed, 51 people were killed in Cairo a couple of days ago, gunned down by the army in one day, when that many people were killed in Syria in 2011, it was all over the front page of the news, and and you have multiple condemnations from both regional actors and international players. When it happened now, obviously there are different dynamics going on in Egypt. However, I think the way that the Syria conflict has numbed public opinion to mass violence in the region, and people perceive it as something that's normal, means that there wasn't that kind of outcry over the number of people killed in Egypt in a single day. And I think that, a bit like you say, as long as it is containable to a point, I think, and it's not really damaging core states' interests. Whilst, as I said in my talk, there has been a bit of movement from the international community. If that doesn't go anywhere, they're not in a position at the moment whereby it is massively hurting any of their interests for this conflict to continue. I don't think any of the actors in the moment are at a point where this is bleeding them. This is no. I mean, people have said like this is Iran's Vietnam and so on, because the number of sort of troops and so on they're committing. At the moment, even for them, it's kind of stabilised and they can sustain this to a point. So it's not at that point. But until you reach a point where those actors are actively bleeding, then I can see the scenario whereby it could go on for a longer time. But again, it will need to end at some point. So you would hope. And so there would be some kind of negotiation at that point. It's just how distraught the situation is now. I would also add that I think that if the regime collapsed, like you said, or sort of started sort of disintegrating, I think once it lost control of Damascus, or if it lost control of Damascus, I think Russia and Iran would seriously reconsider their such active support for them and perhaps be more encouraging of some kind of imposed peace, simply because their justifications are largely based on supporting a sovereign state. And when the Assad regime no longer represents a sovereign state, then I think their enthusiasm for some kind of deal that might rescue something for them would probably increase.
That's all very depressing. Any other questions? Oh, good. So we have one right at the front here, and one at the back there.
I just take the first disappointment that a lot of assessment on the situation because of the role of the Kurds within the conflict. It seems that they didn't even mention that one as a third layer in the conflict. They are both fighting against the regime and also the jihadist groups in the region. On top of that, it's been labeled as a silent revolution within the Syria, and it's probably one of the progressive movements within the Syria, where we can also see some elements of Arabs and Christians are taken part of it, or seeking refuge in Turkey because of the current kind of Kurdish-controlled area and the situation in Turkey. I just wanted to ask a question about how would you describe the position of the Kurds within the social movements, theories, or revolution theories? How would you describe it? What would be your definition for it?
Well, from the
second question.
sorry.
I'll just add, we've been talking a lot about the political role of the international community, but what could be done in terms of stepping up the humanitarian support, since the conflict is going to be as prolonged as you think it may be? What could the international community be doing in order to step up its humanitarian support?
Yeah.
Just as a third option, I wanted to get your opinion. Getting more international support and a neutral voice in Syria, because you have only basically opposition and regime. And a lot of people, I think the majority of Syrians are actually caught in the middle, and they don't want to take sides. And but that voice exactly is missing. in the entire conflict. So there could be maybe some more support on giving a platform to this neutral voice of Syria.
Kurdish question?
And also benefit.
Okay. Let me just let me answer, since I mentioned a couple of times theories on revolution and mobilization. How do the Kurds fit in? I don't think they do fit in, and that's exactly what they have been blamed for by the kind of mainstream protesters and later on the insurgents. Now there have been, of course, exceptions, and there have been Kurds who did join the protest and the anti-regime mobilization. Some Kurds also joined the insurgents, but across the board, and the way they have been perceived, or partly correctly so. But basically, the Kurdish issue has been marked, if you like, by regime tactics and strategies. It actually is another example in my paper of how the regime rather, cleverly operated. And of course, I'm referring way back to the start of the uprising, whereby the regime immediately granted a couple of concessions to the Kurds, and also withdrew most of its troops out of the Qamishli area and in the northeast, basically hoping to drive a wedge between the Kurds and the most predominantly Arab Sunni protesters otherwise. And I think they managed to do that to some degree, to be successful. The Kurds have been actively part of the Syrian National Coalition and so on. But there has been, 2.5 years of bickering about how the Syrian National Coalition, particularly the Arab members of its leaders, what kind of future they had in mind for the Kurds in the post-Assad era. And it's only been recently that they have made some concessions, seemingly, that there would be a degree of autonomy for the Kurds, and that we wouldn't no longer talking about the Syrian Arab Republic, but just about the Syrian Republic. But I think the very fact that they have reached only a compromise on this issue under enormous duress and necessity to unite, and they managed only to reach this compromise at the time that it actually has become irrelevant for developments now, says a lot. And I think that the regime has basically been very successful in driving a wedge between the Kurds and to move the Kurds away from joining the challenge against the regime. Now, from a Kurdish perspective, it may well be understandable, and in fact, I think from a Kurdish perspective, it has probably also been a clever move, because after all, they are arguably the best off at the moment. Also illustrated by your example that indeed Arabs, Syrian Arabs, go to the Kurdish-controlled area to find refuge because it's still seeing relative power for the time.
And it was also similar in Iraq,
Yeah. There's a striking similarity indeed. But then I'm not arguing that this is necessarily a viable kind of quiet or peace. There have been increasing clashes between Kurdish forces on the one hand and members of Jabhat al-Nusra, the Islamic State in Syria and Iraq, increasingly clashing among themselves. And that could, as many have observed, become yet another civil war within the civil war. Contributed further to our rather pessimistic outlook.
Just on the sort of the Kurdish issue, of course, just to add to that, there are different. Well, you're right. We do kind of detach it from the wider conflict, and that's. I suppose that's small because sort of general interest tends to be in sort of like the dynamics in the centre of the country rather than out in the Kurdish regions, but of course, as you say, absolutely, it's very important, and it's a significant departure in sort of northeastern Syria than has been the case in the past, as we've explained. One thing that I'd just like to add to that, of course, is that there are different international dynamics and different international pressures on the Kurdish region than in other parts of Syria. Sort of the, you know, this war is not a war by proxy, but obviously different actors, international actors, have different interests in different things. In the Kurdish region, you've got this three-way dynamic going on between Barzani, who is sort of, you know, president of the KRG in northern Iraq, between the Turkish government led by Erdogan and the PKK, the Turkish Kurdish opposition, and they, in different ways, you know, have different interest in what's going on there. At the moment, you've got in the Kurdish region effectively a truce going on between the two sort of, you know, main Kurdish factions. The PYD, which is the largest and most militarized Syrian Kurdish group, is allied to the PKK, and then there's the KNC, which is allied to Barzani, who himself is in quite a close, unofficial, but certainly economic alliance with the Turkish government. Now, at the moment, you've got a degree of sort of, you know, a truce in that Kurdish region, primarily because there is peace talks going on in Turkey between the PKK and the Turkish government. Now, if those broke down, there's a big question mark as to whether or not their allies inside Syria would start fighting one another. You know, there is a truce, and you would hope they wouldn't, but it is possible that you could get sort of an intra-Kurdish fight going on within the Syrian civil war itself. It's not happening at the moment, thankfully, but that is a possibility. But those factors don't exist in the same way in other parts of Syria, which is why sort of it is separate. Interestingly, just in terms of the fight with Jabhat al-Nusra, and this goes back to this point about the role of the international community and what they can and can't do. You know, for a long time, the Kurdish region was relatively peaceful in this war, and it was relatively detached. Why did the fighting start? At the moment, you know, sort of like, you know, the PYD and mostly the PYD force, actually, because they're the ones with the weapons, are fighting Jabhat al-Nusra and ISIS, the Islamic State, in Iraq and Syria. Well, some people would argue it's because the EU lifted the embargo that banned the sale of Syrian oil. And the Kurdish region in Syria has oil in it, and so you've seen these temporary refineries, sort of like, you know, homemade refineries made by Islamic groups, particularly Jabhat al-Nusra, in parts of eastern Syria, so they can sell this very, very sort of like crudely distilled, crudely refined oil, get it out of the ground and sell it and buy weapons with it and buy aid with it and so on. And of course, they now want to try and get a bit of the oil fields that are also in the Kurdish region. So, you know, there's a way, that was a very sort of short-sighted move by the European Union that has directly dragged what was a peaceful region in this sort of conflict into the war. And now you're seeing quite serious fights. In August, in 1 week, 40,000 mostly Kurdish Syrians crossed into the KRG in Iraq. So, you know, this is an area that hadn't seen that many refugees, and suddenly they flooded over because of this fighting, which is, in my opinion, a direct result of this quite short-sighted EU policy. So you need to look at these things and see, you know, the role that at least the international community can play, which segues quite nicely into your point about the humanitarian situation. Yes, I have been arguing for a long time that actually Britain in particular, which has very little power to influence things on the ground, should be concentrating its efforts on the humanitarian situation. And actually, thankfully, this is something that Britain has been doing. Actually, there's been a bit of a change in policy in recent months. And not only are they amongst the most consistent givers, but they've also started doing what they should have been doing a long time ago, which is chasing up other people to make sure that they're giving the right amount of money. The humanitarian situation is massively underfunded. I think UNHCR estimates they're only 40% funded for the millions of refugees they've got. So, you know, less than half of the money is covered. And they're basically saying, we're running out of food, we're running out of shelter, and winter's coming, and winter in the Middle East is not nice. I don't think it's all sort of sunny. It's really, really horrible and cold, and people without blankets are going to freeze to death and get pneumonia and so on. So they really, really need support. Who are the most culpable in not giving money they promised? Well, it's the same people who are providing the weapons in this conflict. You know, both the Gulf states in particular have promised a huge amount of money and haven't actually followed up with actually producing it. And a big problem at the moment is that states like Qatar, Saudi Arabia, the UAE promised a huge amount, particularly at a donor conference in Kuwait winter last year, but haven't actually produced the goods. So that's something that the international community could be doing, which is actually pay the money they promised, and so on. There are other issues as well about a lack of leadership. I mean, I was in Lebanon this summer, and I spoke to a lot of NGOs working there, and you're getting this situation where, firstly, UNHCR aren't very coordinated apparently, but also you're getting a lot of undercutting, like competition from, again, I'm sorry to sound all anti-Gulf here, but Gulf NGOs are just, literally they pull up, I mean, like they pull up on the coast with a boat full of aid at the end of Ramadan and just just give it out and say, yeah, have some food, which is completely undermining the delicate networks that local and international NGOs have been building based on needs analysis. Like, who needs food, they will get food. Whereas this system of just like, yeah, we want to be seen to be giving lots of food, rocking up with loads of bags of rice and flour and saying, there you go, Qatar loves you or whatever, isn't actually a very useful situation. So even if they can't, I suppose, even if they can't agree internationally on the solution for Syria, it would be good if the international community could agree for the solution to the problems with the Syrian refugees.
All right, well, we are pushing on 8 o'clock, so if anyone has any questions they urgently want to ask, we can take a couple more. So we have one there and one here. Perfect. So, would you like to start?
I just have a quick question regarding Russia. At the moment they're sort of, well, to put it nicely, the fact that they seem so reluctant to intervene and agree with what the West is offering, is it truly because they care about the sovereignty of the regime in Syria, or are they just using it as a sort of facade to try to antagonize the West? I'm going back to the old Soviet fashion.
Hi, Jackson, I'm a student in international relations at King's, and I was just wondering what you thought the conditions, now that the whole chemical weapons issue is not as much of a hot button, specifically for the U.S., what the conditions would be for Western military involvement, and secondly, how that, possibly in the future, and how that military involvement and the escalating of the conflict might affect bordering neighboring states like Lebanon and Israel.
Can I sort of maybe we can both answer both questions? I'll just sort of,
Yeah, sure.
yeah, sure. Russia, first of all. Turn it on its head. Why should they abandon this regime? Seriously, what is in it for them? And it relates to the Western. From the very word go, the opponents to Assad in this conflict have not had a unified notion of what on earth they're trying to do. The opponents, the supporters of Assad, Russia and Iran, have had a very clear idea. Keep Assad in power. Okay, make sure, stand by the regime. Now, there's different motives for Russia. It's not just a question of, it is sort of you spoil Western interests and so on. But there's a lot of other issues in there. They're genuinely worried about the jihadist threats. The North Caucasus could go off at any moment. They're very worried about it. Russia has a very large Muslim population and is very concerned about sort of the blowback. Bear in mind, I think the distance from northern Syria to the northern Caucasus is about 800 kilometres. It's not actually that far. They are worried about that as an issue. There are strategic issues about sort of the Tartus naval base and so on. They want to make sure they hold on to that. But again, I think in the end it goes back to, I don't think any point in this conflict the opposition have been offering anything better to Russia. Seriously, the regime, as has been discussed, is it's not doing particularly well, but it's basically providing what they need in this strategic situation. So, I don't, the moral issues are a different question. You can point to endless accounts of Western hypocrisy where they're backing regimes that are doing quite nasty things. I think the Russians would probably see it through that perspective. Why should we have to suddenly be moral when you're not offering anything alternative? Which goes through to sort of the Western perspective. It's a long list of sort of the different things that the West wants to get out of Syria, the Western Axis. They seem to, at the moment, their goals seem to be topple Assad, bring forth democracy in Syria, stop the spread of Al-Qaeda, stop the spread of chemical weapons, keep Syria united as a country, prevent ethnic cleansing. They've got all this kind of things, all while simultaneously keeping their defence budgets down because they're all broke, and not committing boots to the ground because their populations won't accept them doing it anymore. I don't think that's possible. I think they are completely unrealistic in what they're attempting to achieve, and I think that's been reflected in their policies, which have never been consistent. They've been piecemeal, bit by bit, sort of backed into a corner, feeling the need to do something because it's on the news, but not actually doing anything with any clear strategy. And that's not just America, but also sort of, you know, the West, and even actually the regional opponents to Assad. No one has gone in gung-ho and said, you know what, we're 100% committed to toppling this regime. They've made diplomatic statements, they've given a bit of money, a bit of weapons to the different sides, but they've never committed a lot because actually they're scared of them as well.
But didn't the Arab League ask the UN if they could intervene, establish
the Arab League were interested in establishing a no-fly zone. They were interested in doing something along the... Exactly, you're right. They didn't commit anything themselves. They said, will you please bomb our enemy for us?
Yeah.
You know, that's very different from saying, we're going to commit our troops, we're going to commit our forces to destroying this regime. They're not going to do that at any point. And in terms of the Western, the response to that would be the Western military intervention. I would argue there has never been a single moment in this conflict when the West was actually going to intervene substantially militarily with attackers. Even when they're talking about, you know, Obama's chemical weapons red line recently, that was going to be a limited, punishing attack. That was not a no-fly zone. That was not something that would really change the balance of power on the ground. And I think, quite frankly, you know, the American situation, and as seen by the Libya conflict, NATO is America. You know, the whole idea of sort of Libya conflict was Britain and France will take the lead and America will lead from behind, as they said. Within a week, Britain and France ran out of ammunition and the Americans had to wade in and say, okay, fine, we'll take this over in the name of NATO, but it's basically led by the United States. Unless the United States wants to enforce some kind of military solution onto Syria, it's not going to happen. At no point has Obama, in particular, shown any interest in this. And in many ways for good reason. Because I think, as what we talked about today, particularly this point about the state of the regime and the state of the opposition, if you're going to intervene somewhere, if you're actually going to launch, you know, massive airstrikes, commit bombers and so on, to take out infrastructure, take out the military, you need to make sure that you've got someone to take their place and hold the state together. I don't think the opposition has ever represented that at any point. So I suppose hypothetically, if the opposition, rather like the NTC in Libya did, started representing a viable alternative, and instead the Prime Minister of Libya was kidnapped today briefly, just to look how effective that's proving to be, you know, until the opposition even begins to represent something like that, which they haven't done, and I don't think they ever will do, especially the rise of jihadists, the possibility of Western intervention on that scale is just not going to happen.
I think we've still done a better job of restoring the government than America seems to have done in the past week and a half. The shutdown.
Yeah, well, quite. I was going to say people in glass houses and so on. So yeah, I think the Western military option is off the table. I think it will remain off the table until circumstances dramatically change. And I think, as we've talked about, it's going to change anytime soon.
Yeah. Well, that puts me in a position I can just make a few remarks in addition, perhaps, about the Russians. It's often being suggested, and I agree with your assessment that there isn't really anything in there for them in the scenario of the regime falling, at least for now. But in addition to that, often arguments have been presented that the Russians are motivated by all sorts of interests they are alleged to have in preserving this regime. I think at the end of the day, Syria, their approach towards Syria has been the consequence of a generic approach, despite Syria. And Syria just so happened to be the kind of providing the context in which this approach was made forcefully in the Security Council and elsewhere. And it's a generic approach that has everything to do with Libya, and that the Russians felt that they had been fooled into a regime change enterprise, and they're basically now, adamant to ensure that the international system of states consists of, or is based on respect of state sovereignty, in their interpretation, a rather absolutist interpretation. And for them, state sovereignty, is especially a crucial asset for a former great power that, in terms of its capabilities, is not that great anymore. Now, on just a side note on the whole discussion about and suggestion by the Obama administration about a limited attack. that was so limited that it actually didn't take place. I think actually, if you come to think of it, if you really start to think about what would that limited attack have looked like, I think you very quickly come to the realization that any limited attack would very likely have targeted key military installations in Damascus, particularly on Mount Qassum, where there's basically, you know, the kind of hub of military hardware and personnel of the Republican Guards, and are all concentrated there. It's basically a quasi-military city. Based on the UN reports and interpretations of the UN reports on the chemical attacks on Ghouta and elsewhere in the suburbs of Damascus, I think the consensus is that the rockets were fired from areas, including the Mount Qassum. So that must have been on the radar of military planners in the US. Now, I would argue that an attack on Mount Qassum is not limited at all. Yeah, maybe in terms of the military hardware at the disposal of American forces, it's peanuts. But for the regime, it would have been catastrophic, because it's basically the last line of defense for Damascus and the presidential palace. And I actually also think that is exactly why the regime still allegedly, but I think we can be pretty sure, used chemical weapons against the rebels, because the rebels were actually making some important advances towards Mount Qassum. So that maybe as a side note, what was being said before. Conditions of Western military involvement, I fully agree. I think that's now totally not on the radar anymore, and is not being considered. If it was considered in the first place.
All right. On that note, I think we'll bring the evening to a close. I'd like to thank our two panelists. Coming up at the end of the month is going to be on the American pivot to Asia, the expansion of the Chinese Navy, and the future of geopolitics in East Asia. So look out for that. If you have any requests for talks, just grab me, make a request on Facebook. It'll save me doing something myself. Unless it's a unique subject and I don't want to see it, in which case I don't want to know. And have a good evening.